I'm sewing a maxi dress for summer in vintage fabric, but it's not going to be the vintage fabric I originally picked. So I have a 1940s sundress pattern, Simplicity 2465, which was kind of a holy grail sewing pattern for me. It has halter straps that come from the center front, and the casings make kind of a gathered ruched front bodice, which I think is lovely. The pattern even has boning at the side seams, so it's a fun and kind of different dress bodice to sew. I sewed a version of this dress 5 years ago in a vintage fabric, and I love that version, and I thought it'd be fun to make another one finally. And I thought this time, let's make it a maxi dress, since those are always fun and floaty to swan around in summer. And the skirt length is actually almost pretty much a maxi dress length in the original 40s pattern. So, I knew I wanted to make this in a vintage fabric, so I pulled out 3 likely candidates from my stash. And before we get started sewing here, you can watch the very moment I realized I would not be sewing this with my top choice vintage fabric. So these are the 3 vintage fabrics that I'm thinking about for this dress, and this is the one that I am definitely leaning to the most. The problem with this is it's a really, really sheer fabric. There's no way I'm going to be able to convey this on video, but it's more sheer than I typically work with, and it's funny because I always think, oh, I want a light and floaty fabric, and then I look at it, I'm like, oh shit, oh my god, there's huge rips in this. Well, I was all set to tell you that if I was going to use this fabric, I was considering underlining part of the bodice because it's so sheer, but that doesn't matter because I discovered dozens and dozens of small rips throughout the whole fabric, and it is totally rotten. So yeah, not using this pretty gal, that's too bad. So then there were 2. So I'm going to use one of these for this sundress, and I probably am leaning more towards this one, but I don't know that I have enough yardage of this. And this is a pretty directional print. So part of how I will need to do this is I might need to turn the fabric on the cross grain for the skirt. Not sure yet. So I'm going to fuss around with these and then figure out which one I have enough of to use, and I'm going to start cutting out. And as you can see, I did go with the yellow rose print. Even with only 3 1/3 yards of 35-inch wide vintage fabric, I had just enough when I plotted everything out. The skirt wouldn't be as full as I'd normally want in a shorter dress, but that works well for a longer skirt anyway. But about that ripped fabric, I'm going to say here I am not an expert on fabric, and on further reflection, I'm not entirely sure if it was exactly dry rot or thread rot that affected this fabric, because before I laundered it, I could actually see lighter streaks that I thought at the time were manufacturing defects, but were probably the precursor to the rips. And it didn't seem papery or stink like it had taken on too much moisture over time, and however it was stored in the many decades before I had it. But regardless, whatever the deal was, it sure wasn't going to be sewed into a dress, that's for sure. But no issues with this vintage fabric, so we're full steam ahead. So first plan of action after cutting out the fabric was my usual batching of all things I can sew in one go, which for this dress was the front upper bodice and back bodice darts, the straps, and the side seam pockets. I pinned, sewed, and then pressed all that, and then I sorted out the straps. One end of each strap was closed and one open, and I pressed 1/2 of the long seam allowance to the side. I do this little trick on belts too. I find it's really helpful when it's hard to press the seam allowance open. Even just pressing it to one side helps it lay flatter once it's turned. I used my fast turn set to turn the little tubes. You can sometimes find this kit on eBay or Etsy, but I'll link some alternatives in the description too. By the way, this is a good example of something I mentioned in my video about my sewing notebooks, but right now I'm taking a fast note on the fly in just a yellow pad before committing it to my real notebook. I had a devil of a time turning that tube because I didn't trim down the seam allowance more, even though it was already 1/4 of an inch, but it's such a narrow tube. So I wanted to make sure to remember to do that next time. I don't know if you can really see what I'm doing here, but as I press the tube with the seam allowance along one side, I kind of rock the tube between my fingers just before I press, which I find helps me get that seam allowance super flat. Back to assembling the bodice, and time to pin and sew the center front seam on the upper bodice. It's a curve, but a pretty gentle curve, and you do not trim or clip these seam allowances, you just press them open, because they'll actually form the casing for the straps. Pretty clever 1940s pattern, huh? So next up is sewing the upper bodice seam. This will be the edge across the top of the dress bodice. And again, to try and maximize what I can do with the machine at one time, I looked at the lower bodice piece since I remembered seeing my note on the pattern piece about basting the upper edge. You baste along the seam line, then clip the curves and press the seam allowance in, but we'll get to that shortly. Once I sewed the upper bodice seam, I understitched it to keep the facing in check. And then the pattern calls for slip stitching the seam allowances of the center front on both the bodice and facing pieces, and I'm not really sure this is strictly necessary, but hey, I did it anyway. Here I am not particularly helpfully trying to show while I'm pressing the upper bodice that you leave a gap at the center front on each side of the seam, which will be the opening for each strap and form the casings. So I did that with my understitching, of course, too, leaving that free. So first up in forming the strap casings is pinning the center front seam line so it lines up on the outer bodice and the facing, and then very carefully stitching in the ditch along that center front seam so this permanently attaches the facing and the outer bodice together here. I used an open toe foot so I could see and just did this very slowly. Then you sew a 1/2 inch from the center front seam line on both sides, so I went and chalked those lines first with my quilting ruler and then sewed down those chalk lines. And you baste together the bodice and the facing along the remaining free edges, so the sides and lower edge. But I did an extra step from the pattern here because I know that the lining will likely end up a smidge longer than the outer fabric after understitching. You don't want that to get bunchy on the inside, so I smoothed things out from the outside and trimmed off the excess of the lining fabric before basting together. And yeah, I realize I keep using the term lining and facing here interchangeably on this bodice, but actually you treat it like a lining or a facing on the upper bodice edge, but then on the sides and the lower bodice, it's more like an underlining, so I don't know, whatever. Yeah, don't get too caught up in terminology here. Now remember a bit ago I said for the lower bodice I had to baste along the seam line? Well, time to clip the curves and press that in. I'll admit, usually when it's time to clip curves, I don't notch. I just straight up clip them and don't worry about it unless it's a heavy fabric. But for this bodice, I did actually take the time to notch, cutting out teensy tiny little triangles, since you have to mold the fabric into the curve shape before you even sew it, so it kind of needs to be perfect before you even put it together. Okay, so this part is really fiddly. You have to place the lower bodice with the seam allowances matching the upper bodice, lower edge seam allowances, and then you top stitch that in place. I actually left myself a note the last time I sewed this dress. By the way, thank you for my sewing journal for that. I'll link to that video in the description. But I mentioned last time in my journal that it might be easier to do if I'd clipped into the seam allowance on the upper bodice a bit. So I did do that this time and clipped in just inside the basted together lower edge, and I do think it helped. Another thing I do when I sew something again is I often will get out the original if I think I'll need to reference it. I couldn't figure out how deep the point really should go at the center front, so I smoothed out the casings on my previous version of this dress, measured it, and made sure that my new one was the same. So after much slow fussing with this, I was able to top stitch this together using my edge stitch foot. And while the black is kind of washed out this close up, that's looking really good, right? So here's the front bodice, and this is all looking good. And the way this pattern works, the upper bodice is basically, well, it's sort of half lining, half underlining because it's a lining at the top in a sense, but then you actually treat them, the facing and the outer fabric, as one for the rest of it. So in that respect, it's actually more like just a facing or an underlining. But anyway, so the next step that I need to do is sew the back pieces to the front at the side seams. And this is kind of a weird construction, and I've sewed this before, and I think I thought through, is there a better way to do this? And I just went with what the pattern has because I couldn't be bothered. But basically the back piece is longer than the front piece, and you sew it up to the edge, and then you insert feather light boning in the side seam allowances. So you do that, and then you add the facing for the back. So it's kind of a weird way to do it all, and I don't know why I'm wiggling my hands around a lot, but I'm going to do it per the pattern again. I think if I was going to sew this more frequently, I would probably come up with a better way to do this, but you know what, I sewed this last in 2018, so it's fine for once every 5 years. Okay, so the bodice is constructed exactly like the pattern calls for. The side seam allowances are pressed towards the back. I just finished them with my serger, and then the seam allowance for the back ready for the facing later is just free right now, and it is time for the boning. So this pattern calls for feather boning inside the seam allowance just for a little bit of stability. So I have feather light boning. It's basically just a fabric casing with a little plastic boning inside that you can curve so you don't poke yourself. And this stuff is very easy to use and sew with, and is actually what the pattern calls for. It calls for feather boning. So this is what I'm using. And I have some notes from last time about how I slipped this in to make it a little bit easier. I apparently basted this just inside the seam allowance so that when I folded it over to top stitch, you do 2 lines of top stitching, it stayed put. I did the top stitching from the right side. We'll see how that goes, if it goes as well this time as it did in the past. But the only thing that I thought was funny about my construction notes is I wrote in my sewing journal that I trimmed the casing to 3/4 of an inch on the top and bottom. And I think what I'm trying to tell myself is that this is a 5/8 inch seam allowance on the top and the bottom. I think I'm just trying to say that I made the boning 1/8 of an inch shorter than the seam allowance on the top and the bottom. I don't know why I didn't write it that way. It's not super clear in the pattern, and then I wrote something not super clear in my notebook. So I don't know. That's what I think I'm going for here though, so that when I sew the facing for the back to the back bodice piece that I don't accidentally sew over the top of the boning, and same when I sew the waistline seam. It makes sense to me that that's probably what I meant, so I'm going to try that and then hopefully write a more accurate note this time when I write this up. To make this easier, I marked 1/8 of an inch in from the seam line at the top and bottom edges so I'd know how long to cut the boning. Then what I do for feather boning is I curve one end with scissors so it's not pokey, and then I push the boning out of the way at that end and sew that end shut with several passes of stitches. Then I trim down the boning at the other end, curve it too, and sew that shut too. Then I use quilter's clips to hold the boning in place along the underside of the side seam allowances, so the edge will just be right inside that seam line. And then I use my edge stitch foot to baste this along that edge closest to the seam line. I guess this isn't strictly necessary, but it does mean that when I flip this over to top stitch both sides of the casing, I know I'll catch the casing and it won't have slipped around since you can't really see it from the outside. There's nothing more annoying than sewing something blind from the outside and then find out, nope, didn't actually catch it on the inside. So then it's just top stitching the casing on both long sides of the boning. And when you're done, it makes a nice looking little channel at each side seam. If you were really fussy about the beginning and ending points, you could either box off the top and bottom by connecting the top stitching of each of them, or just have the top stitching extend into the seam allowance. But really, this is under my armpits and looks plenty good for me. Like I said, the seam allowances are pressed towards the back, and the casing is now top stitched in place under those seam allowances. Pretty clever construction from this 40s pattern. So it's on to finishing up the back bodice. Just have to pin the facings to the upper edge of the back bodice pieces. I didn't film it, but I finished the lower edge of the facings with a narrow hem and interfaced them. Remember, this back bodice extends past the front the way this is constructed, so the stitching line has to end right at that edge. So I sewed this with the facings down. So instead of marking the starting point with a dot that I probably would not actually hit, I could see where I had to start and stop to be precise. After sewing that upper back seam, I pressed it, understitched it, and then graded the seam. And then I folded the seam allowances at the side seam under, folded down the facings, and then hand sewed them to the side seam allowance to keep them in place. So I next went to apply fusible stay tape to the center back of the skirt pieces for the zipper, but guess what this isn't? Yeah, that's the waistline, that's not the side seam, so I had to rip that out and the serger thread and redo it. At some point somewhere in there when I was batching seams, I'd sewed the skirt side seams, and now that the bodice was done and the stay tape in the right place on that one side where I'd put it on the waistline first, I pressed the skirt side seams and then gathered the waistline with 2 rows of gathering stitches. This vintage fabric was only 35 inches wide, and I cut the skirt pieces on grain. So the skirt in the front is 35 inches wide, and the back is 35 inches wide, minus the seam allowances, since I cut the pieces in half for the center back zipper. Like I said earlier, this is narrower than I usually go for a gathered skirt, but it works perfectly for a maxi dress. And then we're on to pinning the skirt to the bodice at the waistline seam and sewing that seam with my walking foot so it doesn't stretch out. If you've ever wondered about a walking foot and why it's so helpful for things like this, definitely check out my video on that. I'll link it in the description. And this is always an exciting time when I'm like, yay, you're turning into a dress. And then off to do the lap zipper. First, pinning and sewing the right side of the zipper tape to the right side of the center back. And then moving right along to the left side. This is the part where if there's a print, which there usually is, because this is me we're talking about, I usually marvel at how lovely the print looks matched up across the center back seam, but with this scatter print, there was actually enough spacing between the roses that I placed the center back zipper seam along the blank area instead. So just had to finish that off by top stitching the lap zipper on the left side, and then I could move on to the hem. Now I didn't film trying this on, but I kind of guessed at how long I wanted the maxi dress skirt pieces to be when I originally cut out the fabric. So I tried the dress on at this point and decided to take an inch off the hem. So here's how I handled that, which is a method I picked up from a vintage sewing book. After pinning up the hem to the length I decided would be the hemline, I pressed the hemline and then chalked how much I wanted to cut off. So what I did here was mark an inch that I wanted to get rid of from the raw edge of the fabric. Keep in mind that for this hem, that included the hem depth and the turn under edge that I planned to do. If you were using rayon seam binding or lace or something to finish the raw edge instead, you just cut right at the depth of your hem. So what's left here is the depth of my hem plus the turn under, and I pressed that edge under next and then sewed the hem by hand. Ta-da! And so all I have to do left, well, other than continue to pick lint off, because I will be doing this until the end of time because this is a black dress. But other than that, all I have to do left is basically push down on the casings and pull up on the straps to get that lovely little ruched front bodice look, which looks so nice, and then just tie that on when I'm wearing it and I'm good to go. Here's a closer look at this bodice with the boned side seams and gathered front leading into the straps. This dress turned out beautiful. This vintage print is perfect with this, and the fabric is lightweight enough to be floaty and draped nicely as a maxi skirt length with just the right amount of fullness in the gathered waist. And because of the boning in the side seams, I can actually wear it strapless like the envelope with the straps tied in a bow. I'm definitely in love with this dress. Now I just need somebody to invite me to a garden party. If you'd like to watch me sew more dresses, check out either of these videos, and I'll see you soon with more sewing. Bye!